He told you Azure MFA will become the MFA provider. He assured you it eliminates the 48-hour provisioning delay. He said it eliminates that $10 per day charge for Duo. He promised only enforcing MFA it is truly required, conditionally, close paren. He advised you by the end of 2020, we will apply MFA to O365.
Hello everyone and welcome to UNM Tech Days 2021. You just heard the legendary voiceover talents of Marcus White from our EMSS Workstations team, so special thanks to Marcus for that introduction. So this pre-recorded presentation is a follow-on to one I did last year around the same time about multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. If you weren't already aware, we did go live with multi-factor authentication this past March 2021. You've probably seen it in action, so this will be a quick review about what MFA is, although I suspect most of you know what it is at this point. We'll delve into the 5 lies that I told you at Tech Days last year if you listened to my MFA presentation at that time. These are things that as we work through the planning and eventual rollout of MFA changed for various reasons, and we'll talk about what some of those are. And finally, we're just going to look at some interesting data and facts surrounding the MFA rollout and some of the usage patterns we've seen over the last month or so. Before we get into the nitty-gritty here, I do want to give a special shout out and thanks to the UNM IT Service Desk and the UNM Learn Service Desk. So both of these teams have been instrumental in helping support our users as this MFA rollout occurred and getting things taken care of, restoring people's access, etc. So there's no way we could have possibly done this without you guys. So many, many, many thanks for your help. We really, really appreciate it. So what is MFA or multi-factor authentication? It's basically an enhanced form of authentication that's based on the premise of knowing something and having something. So the knowing is usually our password, right? We all know what our username and password are, and we enter those to log into systems. That's our first factor. The second factor is the something you have, right? And so that's usually a mobile device. It could be a landline phone. It could even be a soft or a virtual token or something in that nature. But it's basically something that you don't necessarily know, but it's something that you have with you. And the idea is that if a malicious user is trying to compromise your account, they're not going to have both of those things, right? They may be able to guess your password. They may be able to steal your password. It's highly unlikely they're going to be able to do that and also steal your phone or hijack your landline or do something of that nature. So that's how it adds security, is it makes it so that second barrier is a little bit harder to break through. If you've seen any of these screens that I'm showing on the slide now, you know what MFA is, right? I mean, this is what Azure MFA looks like, and that's what we rolled out in March. Let's look at a cheesy metaphor to build on that principle. So in the year of COVID-19, you may or may not have seen this. This is actually something that Provost Holloway shared, which is the Swiss cheese model of pandemic defense. So similarly to that, we're going to talk about the Swiss cheese model of account compromise defense. And what this aims to illustrate is that no mechanism is 100% effective at preventing account compromise, right? If someone wants something badly enough, they're going to have it. When you talk about malicious users that are backed by governments and nation states, there's just simply nothing that you can do to defend against that 100%. However, if you do layer a lot of these mechanisms together, you can get very, very close to 100% effectiveness at preventing account compromise. Some of these mechanisms include using a strong, unique password, user training and awareness, using supported email clients that use modern authentication and not legacy protocols, and multi-factor authentication. So interesting data tidbit, a recent survey found that 73% of passwords are actually duplicates. So this means that if a password gets compromised on a service one place, that same password 73% of the time can be used across other services. That's a quick fix though, right? I mean, just don't use the same password that you use on your UNM account for other services like Facebook, Amazon, etc. Basically things that are not affiliated with UNM. So next, looking at training and awareness. I mean, this is kind of the phishing training that we all take each year, and just generally be aware of the email you're receiving, and just look for things that are suspicious. And think before you click, think twice before you enter your username and password on a screen that looks like it's a little bit fishy. So I mean, that's mostly common sense stuff, but unfortunately, attackers are getting more and more skilled at this, and they're still able to fool people with these types of tactics. And then supported email clients, so we talked about that in legacy protocols. Basically the only supported email client at UNM is the Outlook client, right, or the Outlook web app, depending on how you want to access it. If you're using a third-party client like Thunderbird, or if you're using the built-in mail client on your mobile device, like the Android mail client, or even the Apple mail client, we prefer that you use Outlook because that we can attest 100% uses modern authentication, which is going to be something that comes up more and more as the course of this year goes by. But basically use the Outlook app. If you can use the Outlook app, use the Outlook app because that's going to provide you the highest level of security from an email client standpoint. And then finally, we have MFA. And MFA is 99.9% effective at preventing account compromise. Okay, so with that, let's get into our lies. Lie number one, Pistol Pete, the NMSU Aggie, hacked Lucy Lobo's account last year. This was actually fake news. It did not happen. I apologize to our friends, colleagues, and neighbors down south for making this accusation in my presentation last year. Lie number two, Azure MFA will become the only MFA provider for UNM. So in short, it sort of did, right? For everyone besides UNM Information Technologies employees. As we worked through some of our security initiatives over the course of this last year, which included applying MFA to some specialized systems and services, we found that Duo provided a lot more feasible and a lot shorter route to securing those systems than Azure MFA did. So pretty much anyone in IT, it's probably between 200 and 300 people, still have to use both providers. So they'll have to use Duo for some things, Azure MFA for others. But for the 99.999% of students, faculty, and other staff, basically Azure MFA is the only MFA provider you need to worry about. And that's currently in use on all web applications that use Azure AD. So that would be primarily Learn, Office 365 Global Mail, parts of Lobo Web, Zoom, TouchNet, Adobe, and a handful of others. But those ones I mentioned are kind of the heavy hitting applications that use Azure AD and Azure MFA today. So I've been throwing around this term Azure AD, like we all know what this is and are intimately familiar with it, which may or may not be true. So what is Azure AD and what do I mean when I'm referring to that? Basically, it's these login pages, right? So if you're seeing one of these three login screens when you're logging into an application, at least for the first time, that means the application is using Azure AD. Now there are other considerations here, right? Like if you're using stay signed in or don't ask me on this device, you may or may not see all these screens every time. We do recommend that you use those options on trusted devices so you're not having to log in, 500 times per day, which is a single sign-on piece, which we'll talk about briefly at the end of this presentation. But in brief, yeah, if you see these login screens, that means the application that you're accessing is in fact using Azure Active Directory or Azure AD. Okay, so back to our lies. Lie number three, Azure MFA eliminates the provisioning delay. So this is another one that's sort of true, right? Yeah, I love that. You gotta love this sort of true. So the provisioning delay for UNM users is now 4 hours or less. It's the same as it is for provisioning Office 365 or your Global Mail email account, for example. So that part is true. It did radically reduce that. However, the provisioning delay for some HSC users can still be up to 24 hours because of the way their licensing and other things flow through. So, it beats 48-hour provisioning delay. It's still not perfect. There's more work to be done here. So we'll see. Maybe if we do another MFA presentation at Tech Days 2022, I'll have better news for you here, and I can hopefully not lie and say that the entire delay is gone. Lie number four. We will enforce MFA only if it is truly required, conditionally. So this ended up being a complete course change versus what I talked to you about in my Tech Days presentation last year. So conditional MFA would have been a scenario where you'd only be prompted for MFA in some cases. For instance, if you were accessing an application that contained sensitive data, or if your sign-in was particularly risky, you'd be prompted for MFA, or maybe if you were coming from a particular location, particular continent or something, you'd be prompted for MFA. So we ended up not doing it this way at all. Basically, our Azure MFA implementation it's required across the board, right, for all applications that use Azure AD to authenticate. There are no conditions or exceptions. Anytime you access an application that authenticates against our Azure AD, you'll be prompted for MFA. And this MFA is applied at the user level. So you'll see, I'm going to refer to it as per user MFA in a second. That's what it is. Instead of conditional MFA, it's per user MFA. And so when we talk about the conditions and exceptions, do note, and I alluded to this previously, there is the stay signed in and the remember this device functionality that you can use. And those things will basically make it so you don't have to perform MFA every single time you access an application, right? I mean, it's a browser-based thing, but if you're using the same browser, same trusted device, etc., you can get away with not doing MFA for quite a while. So keep those in mind and use those settings wherever you can. So the decision to do this was driven by probably three things. I really only listed one here, but they're kind of one primary thing and two kind of underlying things that contributed to this. So one is cost and licensing, right? So all UNM users already have this per user MFA license. If we wanted to give everyone the ability to do the conditional MFA, that would have been an expense of another $90,000 per year. And as I'm sure many of us have experienced, this previous year has been kind of a challenging fiscal year, right? So we decided to defer on that cost and just use the thing that we already have, and just not pursue the conditional MFA, just do the per user. The other reasons behind this are the consistency of user experience, right? So there are some users that actually have this conditional MFA license at UNM today. There are others who do not. It's about 80-20, probably 80% of people have the license, 20% do not. But if we tried to split this up and do conditional MFA for the 80% that could, and then do the per user MFA for the other 20%, you get an inconsistent user experience, right? So we wanted to kind of standardize that and make sure everyone had the same MFA experience. So that was one of the drivers. And the other was the complexity of maintaining who goes into those buckets, right? Like who's in that 80% bucket and who's in that 20% bucket. Anytime we get into something that's a moving target like that, that shifts based on your role and affiliation with the university, we tend to get ourselves into trouble. So we figured it's easier, it's better for the user experience, it's more consistent. Just apply the per user MFA across the board, and so that's what we ended up doing. Lie number 5. By the end of 2020, we will apply Azure MFA to Office 365. So if you were watching your email between February and March of 2021, you probably saw a lot of these phishing and spam messages come across. I'm hopeful that you didn't, but I have a feeling you did because there were many, 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 many thousands of these that were distributed during that time frame. And these are examples just from, a couple months worth. I didn't even pull January because the volume of this was so high, right? If we had MFA applied, you wouldn't have seen these. This is one of the things and one of the most obvious things that MFA helps defend against is these types of email campaigns, phishing, spam, etc. that are propagated by compromised accounts. So in the context of this lie, we were just a little bit late, right? We ended up applying Azure MFA to Office 365 and all the other applications using Azure AD on March 23rd, 2021. So we're just a couple months late. And I've noticed this, I hope you have as well, but since we've implemented MFA, I think there's been a marked decrease in the number of these strange phishing, fake internship, fake pet sitter, etc. opportunities that have circulated through email. So the volume of that, at least in my experience and according to the data, is down quite a bit. So I hope that you have experienced the same thing and that you're seeing less kind of junk that's circulated from compromised UNM accounts as well. Okay, so now that I'm done calling myself out on lies, let's talk about some interesting facts and data about the previous Duo implementation versus our current Azure MFA implementation and some of the usage patterns we've seen over the last month or so since we went live with Azure MFA. In the interest of full disclosure and for a more apples to apples comparison, the data we're going to look at here is specific to Lobo Web Direct Deposit, tax forms, and benefits. So as you may recall, Duo was only protecting those modules, right? So to make it kind of fair and make things align, I looked at just those modules for Azure MFA as well. Okay, so first up, let's look at authentications by factor. So you might recall from last year, with Duo, most of our multi-factor authentications happened via phone call. So we were about 65%. That's the blue slice of the pie on the left. With Azure MFA, that's down quite a bit. So phone call authentications went from 65% with Duo to 10% with Azure MFA. So that's a pretty big decrease. What's interesting here is the huge increase in text message authentications with Azure MFA. So that's 87% of all authentications with Azure MFA. With Duo, it was only 27%. So that's the red on the left and the right, respectively. So you can see Microsoft Authenticator Azure MFA. but most of that pie is red because most of the authentications are happening via text message. I think this is probably a result of two things. One is familiarity. I mean, text message is a very commonly offered multi-factor option in your personal life, your bank, etc. A lot of them offer text message, so it's a very common thing. The other part is I think the Azure MFA experience for text messaging is a lot cleaner and more streamlined than what was implemented with Duo. I mean, it's basically it just flows. The clickstream works the way you think it would work for text message authentications. With Duo, it was always a little bit wonky, in my opinion. So, and then remember, we had 0% mobile app usage for Duo because we had that turned off, which was a little unfortunate. And we now have about 3% mobile app usage in Azure MFA or Microsoft Authenticator. So that 3%, those are actually my hero, I have to say. This is a purely personal thing. The Microsoft Authenticator app is actually really slick and pretty awesome. It's actually what I use personally. So I really like that factor. It's not as highly used as I would have thought, but then at the same time, I can respect people not wanting yet another Authenticator app on their device just to do their UNM business. So I can see both sides, but that's kind of the breakdown of the authentications by factor and some of the major changes we've seen between Duo and Azure MFA. Okay, next let's compare telephony costs. You might recall from my presentation last year that I calculated the average Duo telephony cost per day for UNM to be around $10. And telephony is just a very small charge that we incurred for each phone call or text message that was used to complete an authentication. So it's usually between 1 and 2 cents, but as you can see, if there are a bunch of people authenticating, that adds up to quite a bit per day, $10. So I also told you last year that Azure MFA has no telephony costs, and that holds true, right? So we're not paying anything for telephony anymore, which adds up to savings for UNM. So you might say, $10 a day, that's just a drop in the bucket, not a big deal. But if you multiply that out over the course of the year, you're talking several $1,000s. And to kind of illustrate this further, what I did was I pulled some of the data from Azure MFA just to project what it could have been, right? Just based on our current Azure MFA usage, what would this telephony cost have been if we had stuck with Duo? And according to my analysis, we're coming out at least $50 per day. I mean, minimum $50 per day on telephony. And this is across the board for Azure MFA. So this would be if we were using Duo for everything, similarly to the way we're using Azure MFA for everything. And that's the absolute best case scenario. I really think it actually would be substantially higher than this. So we actually are saving the university quite a bit of money by moving to Azure MFA. And as we saw in the previous slide, I think we've improved the user experience as well. Next, let's take a look at authentication failure rate. I think this is a particularly interesting metric. It's basically the percentage of authentications by factor that fail. At a high level, the most commonly used factor for authentication tends to have the lowest authentication failure rate. So for Duo, that was phone call with only a 10% failure rate, and for Azure MFA, it's text message with only a 5% failure rate, which is actually down, which is fantastic. Another interesting data point is the relatively high phone call failure rate for Azure MFA. So that's 28%, which is the highest across the board by quite a margin. More likely than not, this is a result of an issue that with the help of our awesome voice team, we were able to diagnose and remediate, at least partially early in one of our Azure MFA pilots. Many phone carriers offer quote-unquote features that block anonymous calls. Sometimes this is called anonymous call rejection, ACR, or something along those lines. Unfortunately, Azure MFA, when it places phone calls, doesn't always offer caller ID information, and as such, it gets flagged as an anonymous caller, and so many carriers drop the call and it never even rings through on the user's line. So I have a suspicion that's what the cause of a lot of these phone failures are. So in short, if you can not use phone call, it's recommended. Use something else. Use text message or preferably use the mobile app, Neil's favorite. Or if phone call is your only option, and I can respect why that might be the case, make sure that you've disabled all your call blocking features if you're going to use the phone call authentication method with Azure MFA. Okay, so lastly we have the remembered device usage metric, and this has some very positive trends in the data that I'm excited to share with you. You might remember with Duo that we offered the capability to remember a device for 14 days to prevent further multi-factor authentication attempts for that time span. So this is a very, very underutilized feature. 7% of authentications use that. So that means that 93% of the time when people were accessing mobile web through Duo, they were either receiving a phone call or text message to authenticate every time. So as you can see, there's been a paradigm shift here with Azure MFA. And this is fantastic news because we tried to market this as best we could when we were talking about the MFA rollout. And in those marketing items were, use remember this device for 365 days and stay signed in. And as it turns out, 88% of authentications with Azure MFA are occurring using those methods. So that means only 12% of the time are people actually getting the phone call, text, push notification in the app, etc. when they're authenticating with Azure MFA. And that is excellent. Just to delve into this a little bit further, looking at that pie chart on the right, that large green slice is stay signed in, and that's what most people are using. There's some utilization of the don't ask again for 365 days. That's the light blue in that chart. But clearly the stay signed in is the winner here. And what's nice is both of those are greater than the MFA completed, that 12% we talked about. And this is exactly the way we want people to use this, right? There's little value in being prompted for MFA constantly on a trusted device. I mean, if someone's stolen your device, you have bigger problems, right? I mean, this is designed not to be invasive, and we're very, very glad to see that people are using these two options to make it so. That's exactly what we want people to do and how the solution should be used. So great job, Lobos. Keep it up. That's fantastic. Okay, last slide. This is just the quick nod to single sign-on or SSO that I promised towards the beginning of this presentation. This is a list of all the applications we moved to Azure AD between 2020 and 2021. So what does this mean? Basically, all these applications now use single sign-on. So if you log into any one of these, that means you can log into all the others without having to type your username and password again, or perform multi-factor authentication for that matter. And in fact, you won't even see a login screen. So I wanted to extend my thanks to all the individuals noted here. Moving these applications is not always a trivial effort. There's a lot of time and a lot of planning and coordination that goes into this. So we really appreciate everyone's time and efforts to make this happen. And we're going to keep moving forward from here, right? On the horizon is moving Central Authentication Service, or CAS, one of our primary identity providers. Once we move that to Azure AD, we should be in a very good position for single sign-on at UNM, and there'll be very few times you have to enter your username and password once you've authenticated once. So stay tuned, more happening this year, and hopefully by next year we'll have 18 more done, if not more than that. All right, so that's all I have this year. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope you got something valuable from this quick presentation here. If you do have questions, you can find me on Teams or shoot me an email, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you and have a great summer.